Good morning. Very warm welcome. I'm Bronwen Maddox. I'm Director of the Institute for Government, and I want to welcome you to the IfG's programme of a packed programme of events today at Labour's virtual party conference, something that all the parties are getting used to this year. And we've been delighted at the response and hope you stay with us for quite a bit of the day. I'm going to kick off by talking to Wes Streeting MP, who is very kindly standing in for Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, as she's preparing for a speech later today. And Wes Streeting, as you know, is MP for Ilford North, has been that since 2015, and is also Shadow Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, and so abreast of all things economic for Labour. Wes, very good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, and I'm sorry I'm not Annalisa, but hopefully I'll be an effective understudy. We'll find out very shortly.
There is absolutely no need to apologise for that. This is a short and sharp event. We're going to have a quick 20 minutes of it around some of the key questions. And let me start right off. I mean, the government's economic response is widely thought to be one of its most successful aspects of the whole coronavirus response. What is it that you would do differently, if anything?
Well, I think after a pretty strong start of being fairly collaborative, engaging with us as the opposition, engaging with trade unions, business leaders, I think the challenge for the Chancellor is that he's adopting an increasingly sort of stubborn posture and sticking to what we've been criticising for some time now as a one-size-fits-all response to the pandemic. We know that for a whole number of businesses and sectors, the impact of COVID-19 has been deeper, it will be longer lasting, and that was before local lockdowns became a new feature of the public conversation and the local economic impact. And yet, despite these very obvious challenges, the Chancellor is still committed to winding back the job retention scheme far earlier than we think he should. We've called on him to take more of a targeted sector by sector based approach. We hear, as a justification for the government's policies that it'd be wrong to keep people languishing in a job that they may never return to, and people would be better off being unfurloughed, let go, and then retraining, reskilling and moving into a different job. But the truth is that most people who are losing their job right now, when you look at the vacancy rates and the fact that our lifelong learning system just isn't really set up to deal with the scale of the challenge, what I think lots of people will be facing is the grim reality of Britain's social insecurity system. They're simply going from furlough onto universal credit. So, big challenge there. So I think he's got to be more flexible, more targeted, extend the job retention scheme and bring the focus back to jobs. And that's really what Annalise is going to be talking about today in her conference speech.
Well, he would say that the focus is absolutely on jobs. You talked about key sectors there. What are the key sectors that Labour would prioritise?
Well, if you look at the sectors that still have significant proportion of people furloughed, is things like hospitality industry. You point to creative industries as well. The theatres, for example, simply aren't able to open. But beneath that, there are other key sectors. Keir Starmer listed some of them last week in his LBC interview. We would love to have a very detailed conversation with the Treasury, who obviously have far more data on this than anyone else. But at the moment, we're still stuck having a principled argument about whether the government should extend at all, let alone what those sectors might be. So we're hoping that with a bit more pressure, there's the chorus of criticism now. It's not just Labour politicians. We've had Conservative politicians, the Treasury Committee, business organisations, trade unions, and it's disappointing the Chancellor isn't being more flexible.
But I want to press you on this point about which sectors Labour might protect, because you've mentioned there the hospitality industry, but that would top many people's sense of an industry that is really going to have to change permanently because of this. It may not come back in quite the same form, either because the coronavirus hovers as a kind of perpetual risk, even if the vaccine begins to work, or just that people's behaviour has changed. And are you saying that Labour would really protect every sector that has been hurt by coronavirus, even if there is perhaps no future for it, or not a future that doesn't resemble the past?
Yeah, well, as I said, there are obviously some sectors that are recovering better than others, and we can see that reflected in the numbers of firms that have brought their workers back from furlough and they're now back at work. but there are other sectors where businesses are perfectly viable, but we need to buy them more time. I mean, the alternative is we simply sort of let people go. They end up on, the already, significant unemployment lists. They're languishing on universal credit. There really aren't a great number of good retraining and reskilling options available. That's something we're calling on the government to address today. And, the cost of that to the country, not just to those families and their communities, but to, the economy as a whole, will be significant. And that's why the government introduced a job retention scheme in the first place, because they recognise this at the start of the pandemic. So I think we've got to weigh up the cost of not acting versus the costs of extending, like other countries have, Ireland, France, Germany. I mean, there are plenty of examples where governments are taking a more flexible approach, and that's what we want the government to do today.
Well, I can see the case for extending the furlough scheme, and I wouldn't be astonished if the Chancellor did it, to be honest, while government is still imposing lockdowns, because if you've got the government telling people that they can't work, and yet that is going to be a temporary state of affairs, then you've got an argument for job support. But I'm going to have one last go at asking. You've talked about a targeted response that you'd like the government to give, and you've talked then again about some sectors you think are viable in the end, but not while these measures are going on. Can you name any of those sectors?
Yeah, I mean, so advanced manufacturing firms that are badly affected. The theatres are a very good example. They are perfectly viable businesses. They are shut down through no fault of their own. I do think lots of those hospitality businesses, by the way, do have a shot at recovering. There's no shortage of candidates, but we're being reasonable about this. The government have access to more data. We would love to go in and have, in the way that we did at the beginning of the JRS, a detailed conversation with government about where you draw the line, because wherever you draw the line, there'll be some controversy. But ultimately, the Treasury have more access to the sorts of data to arrive at an informed decision, and we'd love to have that conversation with them, but at the moment we're still stuck having this argument about whether it's right in principle to show a bit more flexibility.
How would you go about the retraining? I mean, I think there's a general case that is accepted now. If you look at the experience of the Welsh Valley, say in the 80s, that communities don't just bounce back in the way some economics textbooks would imply, that people suddenly retrain themselves. This is something that really can benefit from government intervention. But I'm wondering if we're talking about some sectors, for example, hospitality, possibly airlines, being hit for a long time. How do you get those people to retrain, and what into? How do you pick what the retraining is?
Well, the government put aside £3 billion for a national skills fund, which so far doesn't seem to have left the doors of the Treasury. So there is some funding available. I think one of the challenges is, when it comes to sort of retraining and lifelong learning, it's going to be a bit like sort of building a plane as it tries to take off, because the truth is that lifelong learning in this country has been neglected for far too long. And it is going to be necessary, with levels of unemployment that we're likely to see and a level of structural unemployment we haven't seen in this country for decades, to make sure that people can reskill and retrain into work. I mean, that is going to need the government to move at breakneck speed. At the moment, I would say they're moving at glacial pace, and that is going to be a real challenge for the further education sector in particular, which has a crucial role to play. But it has to be done. And one of the other things we've got to think about as well is the way in which government might stimulate the economy in the short term to meet some of the long-term challenges facing our country on things like infrastructure. But of course, if you lost your job in retail or catering, you're not going to be on a building site on Monday morning getting Crossrail finished or starting off on. This is what I'm thinking. You don't start
to building HS2 or something. So how would Labour go about this retraining? I understand your point about lifelong learning, and that's a really interesting debate, which a lot of people think deserves much more attention. But that's not how it seems to me any government is going to spend emergency funds on trying to get some urgent retraining for people who are hit by this. So, if I said to you, Wes, here's the $3 billion, and you say the government's being too slow, where are you going to go and spend that right now to try and help at least some people retrain who are badly hit by this? Where would you put it?
Well, I think for a start, I would do something that the government has been terrible at doing throughout this pandemic, which is working through our local authorities, metro mayors, to make sure that skills funding is directed to the right places to train people up in this, with the sorts of opportunities that will be relevant to their particular locality, and that will vary from region to region. And I do think that one of the big challenges we've had throughout this pandemic, whether it's the emergency response and sort of getting food and supplies to people, or the absolute catastrophe, which is test, track and trace, and the mess that we're in, central government has got to decentralise and work more through local government. Local government is efficient. They know their communities better than anyone else, and I think that they have a much bigger role to play in the future of skills provision in our country. And actually we could put that to the test right now by directing the resources and the responsibility to local authorities. I think it's no surprise to hear people like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham talking about the need to build back better. I think some of our local leaders get this much better than our national leaders. So I think that would be an effective way to make sure that the money is well spent and on providing opportunities to people that lead to genuine and good employment outcomes that serve the needs of local economies.
Again, a lot of people would be sympathetic to the call to involve local government more, just saying you can't run all this centrally. But what you just described sounds like, for a start, a very time-consuming process, supposing Andy Burnham and lots of mayors and local authority leaders all write into the Chancellor and say, look, this is what the money that we think we need in our area, and then the Treasury has to decide between all these competing claims, which are going to add up to an awful lot more than 3 billion. It doesn't quite give us an answer to how to go and spend an inevitably limited amount of money right now on retraining.
I'm not sure that's fair, actually, Bronwen, to be honest, because I think that a local level or even a regional level, people do understand, and are certainly leaders in local government, I would argue, understand much better than some of the centralised thinking in the Treasury, sort of where the sort of regional economic opportunities are, where some of the skills gaps lie, and have the relationships with training providers in their communities to make sure that the provision matches the needs of the local economy. And I think they are well placed as conveners and with those relationships to make sure that training providers, further education, business leaders are around the table helping to inform and make those decisions. I do think, by the way, as a point of a sort of principle and good practice, one of the reasons why the job retention scheme has been such an effective intervention is that it was designed with businesses and trade unions sat around the table, helping the government to outline the contours of the scheme and how it would work. I think we have to take the same approach now, but learn from some of the mistakes of this pandemic and decentralise. Because, as you say, that the money's there, but it's currently sitting in the Treasury. I'm quite happy to sort of answer questions about what Labour would be doing. Of course, at the moment we're only able to complain. We'd quite like to govern, but it's quite astonishing, really, that these answers are not coming from the government right now, who have both the privilege and the responsibility to lead our country and to make sure that we're dealing with some of these big and fairly obvious challenges. Lifelong learning, a challenge that existed long before COVID-19 was ever heard of.
How would Labour pay for all this? Because lots of money is not sitting in the Treasury anymore. It's been spent, and the addition to government borrowing this year, many figures put above £300 billion, an enormous number. How would you go about paying for this?
Well, I think we're one thing that we have got going for us as a country at the moment is the fact that interest rates are at record lows, and so the cost of borrowing isn't quite as prohibitive as it might have been. Clearly, the government is going to have to spend significant sums of money, both in terms of crisis response and helping to kickstart the economic recovery. There is a debate that is inevitably coming down the path towards us in terms of the impact that has on sort of medium-term tax and spending decisions. We're not at a place yet where we should be doing things like putting up taxes. That would be the wrong thing to do at the start of one of the worst recessions in, sort of 300 or so years. But clearly there are difficult decisions coming down the line. That's one of the reasons why today, one of the themes of Annalisa Dodd's speech and what she was saying on the Today programme this morning is about challenging the government on value for money and where it's been spending during this pandemic. There are a whole number of projects and examples of waste we've pointed to, but of course there is a very obvious and egregious one, which is the job retention bonus, where the government is spending £9 billion on something that HMRC described as a dead weight cost. So we will be challenging government on where it's spending money to make sure that every penny is spent effectively. But for the moment, the government has to do, as the Chancellor said, whatever it takes. And then I think we've got some big questions sort of coming down, across all parties about what that then, therefore means in terms of sort of medium to longer term fiscal policy and some difficult choices ahead. Mm.
Mm. Would you accept, though, that the government can't get it all right, that there's going to be an element of dead weight or money that you, in theory, didn't have to spend in order to get some of the money to the right place? And some of the numbers she's picked out are very small, hundreds of millions pounds, which doesn't sound very small, but in the context of 300 billion more, do seem, in a way, like small beer.
Well, it's all relative, isn't it? I mean, if I talk to my local council leader about some of the sums of waste, I think he would argue that local authorities really need that money and it would make a real difference. So I don't think we should be complacent about waste. And of course, what we are doing today by challenging government waste is also sending a signal about where value for money and fiscal responsibility fits in the context of the new leadership of our party. But, I totally accept what you say. I mean, there are some things the Chancellor did to get money out the door to businesses. We certainly wouldn't be criticising that in terms of sort of business support. But what I found so appalling about the job retention bonus is that this is something that was described as a dead weight cost up front. And this is something where the risks were identified to ministers up front and a ministerial direction had to be issued. And actually, there's scant evidence to suggest that it's making any real difference in terms of the big key challenge, which is keeping people in work. It's kind of neither here nor there. I'm sure some smaller businesses will appreciate the £1,000 bonus, but in the grand scheme of things, it's neither here nor there. And that £9 billion would be better spent elsewhere.
Do you think it's worth, switching subject briefly, but not very far away, is it worth jeopardising a deal with the EU in order to preserve Britain's freedom of movement on state aid?
I'm not sure that this state aid issue is as big as the government is sort of talking it up as. I mean, not least when you look at levels of state aid in other major European economies. I think this has always been a little bit of a red herring, and that some of the state aid challenges are more about our domestic political priorities and the positions of the government of the day rather than an EU question. I do think overall, though, you can't have 1 week the government lauding the Japan deal as great for Britain, and then the next week dismiss the risks of not having a trade deal with the European Union, which is our nearest and biggest single trading partner. And the context of some of the other discussions and some of the other difficult choices we've just been discussing, the idea you would make things demonstrably much more difficult on the economy because of political and ideological dogma in the Conservative Party, it's just crazy, really. We've got to get serious about this. And Brexit's done. We've left the European Union. That argument is dead and buried. However much I might have strong views the other way, is dead and buried. And so, this issue now it's about a single question. Are we serious about striking a trade deal with our nearest and biggest trading partner? And the consequences for both the UK and the European Union of not doing that deal would be serious and severe. The problems are not insignificant, but neither are they insurmountable. And the government and the EU have got to get a bit more serious about this because the clock's ticking and business needs certainty.
Well, speaking of the clock ticking, we're going to have to wrap this up. Wes Streeting, thank you very much indeed for that quick rush through some of the main economic questions of the day. And we're stopping now. Everyone has time to get a cup of coffee and so on before our next event, which starts at 9:30 with Helen Hayes, the shadow for the Cabinet Office, and talking about the future relations between government and the public. Could not be more relevant. So I hope you join us for that. And Wes Streeting, again, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.